Thank you for the introduction, Professor Holloway. I actually feel a little bit embarrassed that I wrote those details down in that bio, not really thinking they would be kind of read out to the audience here, but thank you nonetheless. And thanks to the study, Centre for the Study of Women here at UCLA for giving me the opportunity to present here. And actually, Professor Holloway's introduction means that I can kind of skip through some of the things I was going to say about my dissertation project, but I will just mention that this is my first opportunity to present some insights from the second case in my dissertation, that being the National Institutes of Health and their policies for sex inclusion in preclinical research. So I'm really looking forward to starting to think through that material with you and think about how I can make sense of what's happening in biomedicine under the guidance of the National Institutes of Health. Okay, so we know from feminist science studies and scholars in other fields like critical race studies that the production of biological knowledge is shaped by assumptions and the research paradigms of individual scientific researchers. But significantly less attention has been given to the politics and the structures that enable and constrain particular accounts of difference. So I'm particularly interested in the role that governing bodies play and funding bodies play in shaping the actions of biomedical researchers and the subsequent reproduction of sex as a biological fact. So in 2014, the National Institutes of Health in the United States, or the NIH, released a new policy mandate that required sex inclusion in all basic and preclinical research they were funding. And so the goals of these policies were twofold. First, they're aiming to address women's health inequities, which are presumed to stem from inadequate understanding of fundamental biological differences between men and women. And second, these policies are trying to address this other issue that the NIH is trying to grapple with, and that's reproducibility and problems associated with reproducing findings in preclinical research and translating it to clinical research. The argument here being that inattention to sex differences in preclinical research is one of the key reasons that we're seeing this issue of reproducibility. We also know, though, that recent social science research, as well as biological research, has shown that sex and gender interact in very complex ways to impact health. So gender as a social determinant of health, for instance, can include the different behaviours of men and women. It includes developmental differences in response to social contexts over the life course. It can include different practices of seeking help from medical practitioners and health professionals, different practices when it comes to actually taking medication. So there are a number of ways, many ways actually, that we can think about gender as a structural and social determinant of health. However, the policy priority of the NIH is sex, which is defined as biological and binary. So it's in this context that I'm trying to think about how it is that particular accounts of sex difference become institutionalized through policy and rulemaking, and in this case, through a policy for sex inclusion in preclinical research. So just in terms of a little bit of background, the sex as a biological variable policies, I'm skipping ahead to my next slide, I apologise. I'm going to talk first of all a little bit about the background for the sex as a biological variable policies and just kind of summarise the case for and against sex inclusion in preclinical research, talk about some of my broader research questions, and then just introduce some of the interview material that I've been collecting, which I'm starting to think through. And then I'll conclude with some discussion thoughts and other concluding thoughts. Okay, so the SABV policies, sex as a biological variable policies, stem from this inclusion requirement that was introduced in 1993, the NIH Revitalisation Act, which applied to clinical trials. So the SABV policies take the attention to another level, which is the preclinical level. It was originally intended to include cell lines and animals, But stage one, as this policy is being rolled out, is just focusing on animals for the time being. But the ambition of the NIH and the Office for Research on Women's Health at the NIH is to ultimately extend this policy to research involving cells as well as animals. A bit more on the context for this study and for these policies. So firstly, reproducibility in preclinical research, as I've mentioned, is this parallel issue that's unfolding within the field of biomedicine more broadly, and which intersects with these policies. So the overarching message here from proponents of the policies is that preclinical research has been inattentive to sex difference as a key determinant of health. So knowledge is being built on the male sex, for example, as in the case of, as is predominantly the case in animal research, or knowledge has been relying on cellular materials that, without any regard for the sort of sex origin of those materials, so human cellular materials, for instance. And this, because of this unawareness, this lack of awareness of the sex of the research materials that researchers are working with, the argument is that this has both led to a lack of knowledge about women, or about female sex, but has also led to findings that are difficult to replicate because they aren't taking sex into account, and this is confounding the results of studies. But opposing this message are scholars in feminist science studies, whose project is to redefine binary, biological, and reductionist models of sex difference, and who argue that the solution to the issue of reproducibility and the solution to the issue of women's health more generally doesn't lie in the increased study of sex differences at the preclinical level. So their alternative approach is to emphasise that sex and gender are complex, they're entangled, and they impact health outcomes also in complex and entangled ways. Thus, in their view, the SABV policies are reinforcing essentialised notions of difference, and they're overlooking the role, or distracting us from the role of gender as a social determinant of health. So we see then this kind of dilemma amongst feminists. You know, we have this tension between including but essentialising sex versus this alternative feminist effort to try to redefine sex and gender in more complex and entangled ways. So I'm interested in how sex difference comes to be presumed biological and privileged as such within policy. I'm interested in how actors and organisations located outside of the NIH have attempted to influence or have influenced these policies. And then I'm also interested in the kinds of factors that prevent policymakers from reconceptualising sex as complex, as non-binary, and as intertwined with gender. So I've been collecting semi-structured interviews as well as textual materials in relation to these questions. My data collection is ongoing, so I'm just going to present a couple of perspectives from the interview material primarily that I've collected. I'm focusing in particular on 3 women, each of whom represent a different perspective on the SABV policies, each of whom have been involved in some way in trying to shape the debate around these SABV policies. So the first is Dr. Florence Hazeltine, who worked at the NIH for over 25 years, has a background in gynecology, and who founded an influential women's health organisation that was committed to advancing the scientific study of sex difference, or is committed. It's still an active organisation. It's called the Society for Women's Health Research. And since 1990, it's been recognised as a leading organisation pushing for greater federal investment in research on sex differences and health. And it really promotes a biology-based approach to women's health and advances scientific research in biomedicine as the key form of knowledge needed to address women's health needs and their specific disease experiences. So they're very well connected with Congress people in DC, with policymakers in DC, with pharmaceutical companies who are amongst their main financial supporters, and Dr. Florence Hazeltine has really been at the forefront of these efforts since the 1980s. So she, when she was talking about the role of pharmaceutical companies in supporting the kind of work that the Society for Women's Health Research was doing, she said, for instance, that we are often accused of being deep in the pockets of the pharmaceutical companies, and my answer is not deeply enough. So she's really in this professional non-profit organisation kind of world and recognises that you need money to be able to impact policy and impact Congress people. And through the fundraising efforts of the Society for Women's Health Research, they've been able to support biomedical scientists who study sex difference to share those findings more broadly and to sort of produce very influential publications to shape the way that people are thinking about sex difference and health. The second person is Dr. Margaret McCarthy, who is president currently of the Organisation for the Study of Sex Differences. She's a neuroendocrinologist, and she's really built her career around the study of sex differences and has over time become more involved in the sort of advocacy efforts of both organisations like the Organisation for the Study of Sex Differences, but also the advocacy efforts of the Office for Research. Put a face to the research in the field of sex differences and to give legitimacy to that kind of agenda. So scientists are definitely being brought in as part of advocacy efforts to promote this research agenda. She talked about how it was like really exciting to be impacting NIH policy, how incredible this experience was. And she also noted when she was talking with me that she was aware that feminist science studies scholars are amongst the critics of her kind of approach to sex difference. And she said that she was aware that there are legitimate arguments to be made from that side, the sort of science wars, or from the people who are critical of these essentializing accounts of difference. But she also said that these kinds of arguments aren't really of interest to the Office for Research on Women's Health. The Office for Research on Women's Health is in a context where certain kinds of science are valued and where social scientific critiques of science aren't really consistent with the kinds of knowledge that they value and the way that they're actually defining sex difference, which is in a very biological and binary kind of way. I'll just say introduce one last perspective before I wrap up. So this is Dr. Stacy Ritz, who is in molecular immunology, but who has also now started to sort of transition into feminist science studies and bring her perspective as a biomedical researcher to the feminist science studies agenda. And she really, she's whereas the other two women I've talked about are strong supporters of the SABV policies, Ritz isn't, because she finds that the policies are inconsistent with her understanding of sex as complex and entangled with gender. So, she says that including women, addressing women's issues, addressing males and females is necessary to reverse and undo the harm that's done by excluding them. But the answer isn't just to include them and then treat them as if they're different, because this is just going to introduce harms in different ways. So she's really trying to push for a more complex way of thinking about what sex is, what gender is, and how the two are related to one another, how they both impact health. Whereas she's a Canadian researcher, and we see from her, I've learned from her experiences that the feminist science studies critiques of these kinds of policies have gained much more leverage in the Canadian context than they have in the US context. Her accounts reveal that there is a very specific kind of cultural context in the United States that elevates sex as biological above more politicized and critical accounts of the role of gender, or more critical accounts of what sex, the constitution of sex and how it relates to gender. So specific to the US context is the take-home message from Stacey's insights. I'll skip through this and just move on to discussion. So I'm only beginning to sort of think through the interview material and the textual material that I have and start to draw out some of the implications and start to think about what it means for understanding how these policies came about. One thing I think that's clear is that there are strategic alliances between a variety of actors that are located both within and outside of the NIH and which have enabled these policies to come to fruition. And these are both political and epistemic alliances because they're harnessing political means and harnessing a certain kind of science to promote the production of knowledge about difference and about sex difference in this case. These are also exclusive alliances in that they require particular credentials, particular resources to get access to these sort of decision-making and influential circles. But even more importantly, to get access to these circles, you have to have ideological alignment with the agenda of biomedicine as a field in the United States, and ideological alignment with the agenda of the National Institutes of Health and the Office for Research on Women's Health. So a key critique of the SABV policies from feminist science studies is that they overlook the role of gender as a determinant of health. And it's also argued that sex and gender have to be understood as having interacting effects that can't be disentangled. But the accounts that I've collected so far in my data collection show that NIH policymakers and the actors that are in the surrounding scientific context aren't conceptualizing sex and gender as being in complex interaction, or gender as being a significant factor at all to health. Sex, on the other hand, is represented as a straightforward subject of scientific inquiry that can be objectively studied, while gender is associated with messiness and with politics. So such moves reproduce an essentialized vision of sex as binary, as biological, as prior to gender, while overlooking potentially important social contributors to adverse health effects experienced by women. So I just presented some preliminary findings and analysis here, and I've sort of only brushed over the experiences of 3 women who I've spoken to, each of whom offer a different perspective on these policies. But in terms of next steps, one thing I haven't been able to do yet is really get interview access to people within the National Institutes of Health and the Office for Research on Women's Health. So that's where I'm hoping to be able to go next with my data collection. But in the meantime, I'm trying to map the sort of broader infrastructure of biomedicine and policy making related to that sphere, and further unpack these questions about how we arrive at these policies that produce a very centralising and reductive account of sex difference and sex in relation to gender. Thank you.